there's a differentiation we can make between like a violent TV show or a violent video game and what we're seeing in the news, which is reality.
Yes.
So for me, when I heard, I think it was on Sunday or Monday, that I don't even remember which side had bombed an entire high-rise and there were human beings in there, that was just so horrific. Like that just rattled me to the core to just imagine all those human beings wiped off the face of the earth in one bomb. That's very different than seeing, a Bruce Willis action movie where the same thing happens, because I know in my mind that's false. That didn't happen, but this is reality that we're talking about.
Hey, welcome everybody to the River City Waves podcast, where we're having conversations about navigating some of life's important questions. My name's Kenny, and as always, joined right here by Pastor Robby. How's it going?
Hey, well, I've had better weeks. The Packers lost on Monday night.
Oh my goodness.
To the worst team in football.
I was going to say that's
the Las
football,
Vegas
right?
Raiders.
Okay.
Yes, that is football.
I wanted to be sure.
And I was like, they were underdogs, and the line beforehand was like they're underdogs, and I was like, well, why are they underdogs? Well, we saw why. They lost to the Raiders.
It was painful.
We'll have to keep you lifted in prayer, Pastor, on that one.
Yeah, God, it's not all sunshine, roses, and rainbows for me.
That's right. Tracy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It is awesome to have you here. For those who may not know, for those who maybe are living under a rock, you are married to Robby.
That's right.
That's right. How many years?
33 years.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah,
that's
thank you.
awesome.
Thank
and
you.
we're just glad to have you today. I was thinking of all the things that you do with your training, with your experience. You're a life coach, you're an educator, you're a pastor. I was wondering, is there anything you don't do?
Well, I don't do things mechanical, that's for sure. I can't really make sense of a car engine.
That's okay. There are people that do that.
Yes. I'm so grateful for them.
She did install a doorknob recently, though. It was
I
pretty
did.
impressive.
And it is upside down, I think, because I bought it facing the wrong direction, but it works, so we're going with it.
So just leave well enough alone.
Yes.
And you can't tell that. It's awesome.
We're our own worst critics sometimes, right?
Right.
Well, glad to have you here. Have you
Thanks.
guys been having a good week? This is what I need to know. I mean, we've already heard about your disappointment in the football team.
Yeah.
Other than that, has it been a good week?
On some levels.
Okay.
I mean, I enjoyed lunch both days this week.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Okay, I can get behind that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, I've had a great week. The sunshine's been out. The
love
weather's
that.
been awesome. I've been getting some outdoor time in, which is always a great thing for me. I love being out in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I've had some great conversations with friends and clients and colleagues, and I met some new people last night at dinner, and
Awesome.
people new to River City, and that's always something I enjoy. So it's been a good
for
week.
Sure.
I love
Yeah.
it when the weather cools down.
Yes.
Ultimate favorite of mine.
Yes.
Love it, love it, love it. Born and raised in Florida, have had plenty of heat. I like the cooler weather.
Yeah.
I'm
It's
with
nice.
you. This is
Let's
just
talk
perfect.
about it in January, mid-January.
Right. Ask me then how well I like it.
Oh,
Fair enough.
yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's been a good week. Been an interesting week. Been a difficult week on many
has.
ways. Right now, what's going on kind of on the world stage with Israel and the devastation, the unexpected devastation that's going on there, just really been shocking.
Yeah, I think that's a great word for it. I think everyone's shocked.
Yeah.
Leaders, intelligence officials, citizens, of course,
Right.
and then all the rest of us left watching it.
Yeah.
And it's shocking to me that it continues.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't just a one-day thing, but now it's back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah. And as of the recording of this podcast, we're only a handful of days removed from the onset of this. But as you say, like just continuing to watch that unfold is really difficult and really makes today's kind of theme or topic of our podcast especially pertinent. Talking about navigating crisis,
Yeah.
talking about how to remain spiritually strong and mentally strong and healthy in those ways as we are navigating really, really hard times.
Yeah. And I think especially, the caveat that today we're talking about navigating crises that happen in a larger perspective
Right.
than just our own personal crises.
Right.
But what do we do when the world is in crisis or our community is in crisis?
Yeah.
When there's this big sweeping event that happens, and how do we deal with that spiritually, emotionally, all the things?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it makes me think about how, you know, one of the things we champion in the present day, actually for the last couple centuries, is the idea that, you know, I should learn everything that I can. I need to know everything that I possibly can. But actually, you know, that was the temptation in the garden, right? To not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the one thing that they weren't supposed to do that brought death to them. And I think one thing that tells us is that there's some knowledge that we could have that it doesn't ultimately help us. It breaks us. And the way that media and the internet is set up, it's almost like we almost have a chance instantaneously to be anywhere in the world and to see any of the most horrible events that you can imagine in real time. We can see these things. And the thing is, we're not built to be God. God sees all things at once. Yeah. We're not built to be able to handle that kind of experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. Because of news and media being available 24/7, people, producers are looking for content. And so they're pushing the limits on what they are showing. And it includes horrific things that we wouldn't have seen before such pervasive media culture. It's one thing to read about a horrific tragedy in words, but it's a whole other thing for us to visually take it in, for us to hear the sounds that are happening during it. You know, just in this crisis in Israel, there have been horrific things that have been shown in how hostages have been treated, how prisoners of war have been treated. And I think sometimes we fight a battle in ourselves because there's some part of us that feels like we need to stand there to kind of testify to the horrific nature of it, to take it in as a way of empathizing with the person who's being murdered. But at the same time, there's a part of us that's repelled by it and that wants to shut it off. And I think it's really important that we find a balance there. I think when we are going through a crisis like this, whether it's violence in America, violence abroad, anything horrific, it's really wise to limit our exposure to news media.
Yeah.
And especially visual and auditory forms of the news media. It's really important that we limit that, because what can happen in our minds, the more that we see it, is we start to internalize it, and our brain can think that that's happening to us, and it can trigger all kinds of trauma symptoms in us if we have unresolved trauma from the past, or if we have resolved trauma but it's still a little bit fresh, or the scars haven't really scarred over all the way. It can really bring up our own difficulties, and then we go into this trauma cycle. And so limiting exposure to the media is very important.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course, some of the strongest people that I've ever met are soldiers. And I know also from those soldiers about the ways that war and combat, for some of them, it breaks them on the level of their soul, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Yeah. And it's not that they weren't strong or they didn't know how to put things in their place, but it's that exposing ourselves to this kind of violence and so on. If we have a steady diet of that, it's going to do things to our minds and our emotions.
Yes, and I think in this case, there's a differentiation we can make between like a violent TV show or a violent video game, and what we're seeing in the news, which is reality.
Yes.
So for me, when I heard, I think it was on Sunday or Monday, that I don't even remember which side had bombed an entire high-rise and there were human beings in there, that was just so horrific. Like that just rattled me to the core, to just imagine all those human beings wiped off the face of the earth in one bomb. that's very different than seeing, a Bruce Willis action movie
Sure.
where the same thing happens, because I know in my mind that's false.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't happen, but this is reality that we're talking about.
I'd never considered what you're both now unpacking. I'd never considered this idea that before this exposure to media, like you were talking about, Tracy, that our input for our reality was what we ourselves witnessed. Grocery store, driving down the road, I'm in my home, I'm in the office. And yet now the input that we're experiencing, like you said, is all over the world, right there in the palm of our hand or on our desk. We're seeing things that others are experiencing. And it never occurred to me that my brain could then interpret that as something that I was experiencing.
Yeah.
That's a really profound and wise thought. Where do we go from there? We've talked about this idea of how to kind of put some safeguards in place, maybe by way of reading versus watching some news, or limiting what we watch and what we're allowing our eyes to take in that way. But what's something else, like another step that we can take?
So one thing that I think is really important as believers is that we remember that every person in the entire world was created by God.
Yes.
Every person involved in this conflict in Israel on both sides are precious to God. And so we can tend to become very kind of myopic, maybe, if we are limiting our understanding of the situation by listening to one news source, particularly if that news source is very entrenched in one worldview. So for me, it's very important to find other sources of news so that I'm understanding it from all different sides. It really keeps my mind from taking stakes in the conflict, choosing sides, and thinking that, I'm now engaged in the conflict. I'm now taking up a side. Instead, as a believer, for me, I went to Al Jazeera because I wanted to see what they were seeing. I went to some, I don't think it's called Twitter anymore, it's called X. But if you can go to a source like that, you can see feeds from reporters directly on the ground who are affiliated with all different kinds of news sources. And for me, it helps keep a balance in my mind to hear from all sides. So I think that that's an important caveat. And then I think it's really important to talk about what we see right away with other people. In my case, other believers. I want to talk with other believers about what do you think about what's going on?
It makes me think back to the pandemic, you could watch that all day long. Or it makes me think about 9/11, how, there was nonstop coverage of every episode of that. And you could feel, or every single day, it was like all day long, every angle of that issue. Or like when the pandemic was happening, same thing. And I can remember feeling like being ratcheted up and recognizing I got to turn this off. Yeah. I got to limit my amount of time to even think about this, because it's not good for me. Yeah. And the thing is, when particularly if you're just taking in news from one source, and you are in an echo chamber, and it doesn't matter if that's conservative or progressive or whatever. If you're in that echo chamber, you will eventually hear lies and distortion, and you will eventually be encouraged to pick up attitudes that actually, as a follower of Jesus, you should not have.
Right.
And so putting these boundaries around it is good.
Right.
But I think the next thing we need to do is to look to God.
Yes.
Yeah.
We need to pray to Him our concerns and fears, and ask Him to bring peace not only to the world but to our own hearts.
Yeah.
We read so much of that in Philippians. Yeah. That very idea. And to your point, healthy boundaries does not always equal ignorance. It's not, the ignorance is bliss. I'm going to be wise. I'm going to guard my heart.
Be informed.
I'm going to be informed, and I'm going to make sure that echo chamber is not a place I'm living in.
Yes.
That's really good.
Yes.
Yeah. I so appreciate, and we often, if you've been around church for any length of time, you often hear that passage quoted from Philippians, be anxious about nothing, but by everything, by prayer and petition, present your request to God. I love that reminder of, okay, be informed, but remember to go to the Lord in prayer and keep your focus where it belongs.
You know, that's really great. I think that's a perfect verse for us to really dwell on. And I love the word keeping your focus where it belongs, because I don't think we are meant to sit in that crisis. Sure. That is happening to people that God cares about. And I certainly have spent lots of time in prayer for those matters. But God has me here, right here in Lafayette, Indiana. And that means he has tasks for me to do here. And if I'm so distracted or overwrought by the crisis that's happening that I can't take care of the life that God has given me here, that's a clear sign that I need to draw a different boundary.
Yeah.
I need to back up and let go of that conflict and not be so hyper vigilant about needing to know all the details, that sort of thing. So I think we need to pray. We need to pray that God shows us what does he want us to pray about. You know, God, what's needing spiritual fire here? Where do you want me to put my spiritual energy? What should I be praying about here? You know, certainly we want to pray for peace.
Right.
We want to pray for safety. We want to pray for the souls of people to find Christ somehow in this conflict. We want to pray for wisdom for the leaders, discipline for the leaders, patience and compassion for everyone in decision making. But I also think God wants us to focus on what we're doing right here. He has lots of good works for us to do. And the more that we can continue to do the good work here, I think Jesus referred to this with the big word occupy. You know, until I come, I want you to stay and be about my work and stay occupied in what I've given you to do. And I think that's very healthy. It's a healthy thing to do, to let go of the conflict. And it can feel very weird to hear news about so many people dying at the hands of other people and then go do something joyful. Sometimes we feel like we need to mourn. And mourning is certainly important to do. Finding time to grieve the human loss, the toll on humanity is very important. Do that in the presence of God through prayer. But then go out also and live the joyful life. Find someone to do something enjoyable with. Go worship God. Go to your life group. If you're in a life group at church, go to your life group and spend time with those people and enjoy life together. I think that's a really important way to balance the heaviness of the crisis.
And I also know people who, when they see something going on like this, they give to organizations that are humanitarian organizations like Convoy of Hope. Convoy of Hope is present in all these military theaters normally, and you can give to that crisis financially, and that's a way to do something. If you feel frustrated because you want to do something, that's a way to do that. You can find that link in the notes.
Yeah, that's excellent. What would you all say? I want to ask so many questions because so much of what you're sharing is very deep and very rich. What do you say to the person who may be listening and says, I find it so difficult to pray when in crisis? Some people view a crisis taking place, as we've talked about, that's not happening to them specifically, but they own it and wear it as if it is. Or people who are living in very real crisis in their life today while they're listening to this, and they go, okay, I hear you saying I need to take this to the Lord, but at times I feel so weak or so overcome by this thing that I'm navigating. I don't even know how to pray, how to bring this up to the Lord. What would you say to encourage them? Are there any tips or things that you would say to them to go, hey, try this to kind of get back into alignment while you're navigating such a difficult thing?
I think part of what you're speaking to is the concept of lament and grief. And in our modern Western world, we do not like to talk about lament and grief. It's very sad and very uncomfortable, and we tend to isolate ourselves from that. But there are good chunks of the Bible that really focus on the fact that grief and lament are part of our human experience. And when I am stuck, when I am having a hard time feeling like there's no hope, I don't even know what to pray for, kind of a thing, I might actually start in the Psalms or in Lamentations, where the writers are pouring out grief and saying, you know, everything seems lost. I can't find any hope. And the reason why I like to do that in the Bible is because at some point those biblical writers recognize that God, the presence of God in the midst of all that's lost, in the midst of the tragedy, his presence alone is hope. It's hope because he's alive in the midst of this hardship, but it's also hope because then we are not alone. And so I think that's really important to become familiar with what the Bible says about lament and grief. And the second thing I think is just to be honest with God. We don't need to pray prayers of victory when we're not feeling it. God knows what's going on in our heart and mind anyway. No, we're not fooling him at all. And so when we can just say, this is hard. I don't understand. I feel so horrible because of what's going on. How could you let this happen? I think that's a big question a lot of people wrestle with that can keep them from turning to God, is how can you let this tragic loss of life happen? I don't know that God's going to necessarily grace us with an answer to a question that plagues humanity. This could go back to like some knowledge that's too heavy for us to understand, and God protects us from that. But I think that when we can at least say it to God, he can hear us and comfort us.
You know, I think that it's important to recognize that most of the Bible, most of the stories of the Bible, and most of the Bible content is given to us in a context where people are being oppressed, or they're at war, or they're being chased, or they've been enslaved. And so, you know, the Bible has all these amazing resources to help us approach that. And particularly when we come to a situation like this one in Israel, you know, the first requests of the Lord's Prayer are your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And those are meant to give us a pretty broad spectrum to be able to address problems, because he doesn't prescribe what that means in all situations, but it gives us a context for that. And I agree with Tracy. You know, the Psalms show us that it's right to pray our pain to God, because so many of the Psalms are the psalmist is completely disoriented by something that's happened to them, or that is happening to them, and they tell that to God.
Right.
And you see in many of the Psalms, by the end of the Psalm, God restores their sense of trust in him. But being open with God about how you really feel, that's where real prayer comes from.
That's really, really great. I love this suggestion of going to the Word and being able to identify with those who have been maybe in different particular circumstances, specific circumstances, but have gone, you see it modeled, they've gone to the Lord and they've seen the goodness of God prevail in their life during really, really hard times. Sometimes we just need that reminder. Like, I'm not alone. I'm not the first person to have dealt with a hard thing. I'm not going to be the last. And I have a loving, faithful God who is available to me and wants me to share what I'm going through with him.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, I just want to point out that for many Christians, when they see this stuff happening in Israel, there are alarm bells that go off, because maybe like they heard a lot of sermons about Israel and about the end of the world. And I think, you know, certainly God has a special place for the Jewish people. And one thing that, for instance, in Romans 9-11 is made clear to us is that God is going through the end of time to be about redeeming his people and causing them to see Jesus as their Messiah. Now, I don't know how this fits into that, but I know that whenever whenever world events are happening in Israel, and so many have for such a tiny place, it's an outsized impact on the world and on history that's come out of Israel. But whenever something important is happening there, I need to pray, Lord, let your kingdom come. I need to pray, God, let your plans unfold here, because this obviously has greater dimensions than simply things that diplomats have been talking about, and something so important to recognize. Remember that the apostles, right before Jesus ascended into heaven, they looked at him and they said, after everything that had happened, they said, Lord, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus does not chide them. He simply says to them, that's for the Father to know.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is the reason why also this means more in some ways to Christians as they're looking at this, or in some ways we really do identify with the Jews, the pain that they're going through, but we need to pray, God, let your kingdom come.
Yeah. Wow. Really, really good. Any final thoughts that either of you would want to share as it relates to a follower of Jesus, a Christian who is, like we've said, either navigating crisis on their own or even in response to things like what we're seeing happen in Israel, that you would say, like, hey, one final thought, like if you would take anything away from this conversation, I would want you to know this as you're navigating crisis as a whole. Is there kind of a final thought that you would share there in response to that? We've talked about pray, have healthy boundaries, get in the Word. I think all those are very useful as well.
Well, the biggest final thought I have is that God is faithful and God is greater. And as believers, we need to remember that God is still very much in control of the world.
Yes.
And his purposes are not going to be thwarted or sped up or slowed down because of what's happening in the world. When we can rest assured in who God is, it gives us comfort as we see these things happen. But if I could just add a quick second thing, it would be, and I know we say this a lot at River City Church, but get in a group.
Yeah.
These things are hard to navigate on your own. And if you're only dealing with them inside your own head, you're going to trip over yourself.
Yeah.
But when you can get in a group and talk it out with other people, it really lowers the intensity of it in our own life. And so get in a group of believers and talk about life. And life groups are perfect to do that.
They are. The enemy would love for us to be siloed.
Yes.
For us to be that island by ourselves, out and away.
Yes.
And he operates in confusion and chaos and deception. And when you are not surrounded with people who can help you go, hey, there's a blind spot there. No, that's not what you think it is. When they can shed light into the plan of the enemy in our lives, like that's a way we can overcome that through that power of community, through other like-minded, like faith believers. So I second
absolutely.
that. That's awesome. Pastor Robby.
Yeah, I would just say it's important to remember Jesus said that there would be wars and rumors of wars. These things would keep going. But one thing that's unique to us as Christians is we believe in the resurrection, is that the resurrection, we see that as the beginning of the renewal of all things. And so regardless of how dark things get or how weird things get, God is still going to bring the renewal of all things to pass. He's going to make a new heaven and a new earth. He's going to make the resurrection change everything. And it's beginning with us. As believers in Jesus.
That's so good. Thank you both for everything that you are sharing and that you're lending to this conversation and your leadership at River City. You are both brilliant, bright, intelligent people with a wealth of wisdom, and I just honor the both of you. Thank you so much for sharing in this. This has been really helpful to me, and I know to those who are listening as well. So as we continue to pray for the things that are going on in this world, like the crisis that's happening there in Israel, we're also continuing to pray for all of you who are listening, praying that the Lord is speaking to you, praying that you are gaining just so much help and wisdom and things from these kinds of conversations as we're navigating navigating really important topics and things in life. So just know that we're praying for you. If this information is helpful to you, would you do us a favor? Rate this content wherever you're consuming it. Share this with others. Send it in link form to those who might really benefit from this, just so that we can continue to try and help other people. And just know that this content drops on the first and third Tuesday of every month. So just a reminder for you there. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and we will see you next time on River City Waves.